Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. Okay, welcome to the Stoa, everyone. I'm Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa. And the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And when I first created the Stoa, I envisioned it to be a space, a digital space for us to have important and difficult conversations. And I was happy when I was talking to the brothers who co-founded Letter, Dane and Clyde, who are here today, about collaborating with between the Letter platform, the conversations that happen there, and to have conversations on this digital campfire, such as the Stoa. And we came up with something called Postscript. The idea here is that conversations on the Letter platform, popular conversations, continue on after the fact here in person. So having the two interlocutors expressing themselves in a different medium and seeing how it goes. So that's the idea of Postscript. And I will introduce the two interlocutors today and then the format in a moment. But first, I'll hand it over to Clyde to kind of speak on Letter broadly for people who may not be familiar with it. And you're on mute right now. I muted you, so you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
There you go. I'm back. Thanks, Peter, for that intro. I guess for the people who are not familiar with Letter, it's probably two ways to describe it. One is kind of the mechanics of how it works. It's a place for any two people to have an exchange, a conversation via the exchange of written letters. But really, it's a place that's trying to repair the health of discourse by bringing people together who disagree, but when they disagree, view each other as collaborators rather than ideological enemies. And I know you're going to be interviewing Buster and BJ, and I think they're just such outstanding examples of the kinds of individuals that are helping to create a new type of dialogue online. Letter has hosted hundreds of conversations now between people who view the world through different lenses. And I think in reading those conversations, we're all invited to take a journey to try and figure out what's true. And I think that overlaps incredibly well with what the Stoa is attempting. And it's a real privilege to be associated with this community and with you, Peter. So I'll let you get into the interview, but then I'll be observing. And if there are any questions for us at any point, either we'll come back or I'll be here. So tag me in. Thank you.
Very cool, very cool. And I definitely recommend everyone to check out the Letter Wiki platform. And if you're inspired to have a conversation from anything you heard here, feel free to go on the platform and you can continue the dialogue there. So yeah, today we have BJ Campbell and Buster Benson, and they had an exchange on the Letter platform called Guns in America, which was the runner-up for the Impossible Conversations competition that Letter had recently, which just got announced today. So congratulations on the runner-up status, guys. Buster, Benson, I'll allow them to maybe introduce themselves if they want to flesh it out more, but Buster is an entrepreneur and writer. He wrote a book called Why We're Yelling. And then BJ Campbell, he's also a writer on a blog called Hand Waving Freakoutery, and he writes about guns and culture war issues. And so what we're doing today is Buster will go first for 3 to 5 minutes. He will say his current position, stance on guns in America. And then we'll tag in BJ, and then they'll have an open conversation for about 20, 30 minutes. And in the chat, if you're inspired to have any questions, just write it down. This will go on YouTube, so if you want me to read on your behalf, indicate that in the chat. And then after the 30-minute mark of the conversation, we'll tag in some questions. So that being said, I will hand it over to Buster.
All right. Hey, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. I'm going to try to summarize what a 14,000 word letter exchange between BJ and I was like in 3 minutes, and then BJ can step in and tell me where I've made mistakes, because a lot of it is, it's probably still in my perspective. So we were introduced, we both belong to a community on Facebook that has, some of these conversations, but we were introduced to each other by mutual acquaintance to have this conversation on Letter about guns in particular. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do that, because I had tried to host salons on gun control. I live in Berkeley, California. It's really hard to find people that are really willing to take the opposite position on guns. And so to find someone like BJ who had not only a strong position, but actually very eloquent and articulate about this position, and a lot of articles on Medium. And I was super excited to do this. It started off with just a question of, what I think is called a sort of a pretty perfectly stupid question, which is, does every single gun sold in America add to violence in the country, or reduce violence in the country? And I stated it purposefully vague because you could think of, some people think of guns as a defense, and some people think of the guns as a menace. And in both cases, the concept of safety is sort of core to the whole argument around guns. And it is so simple to reduce it down to, like, do they just simply make the number go up or the number go down? And BJ quickly corrected me and sort of teased apart and said, like, there's the suicide number, there's the homicide number, there's, the just violence in general. There's like replacement violence that would happen with guns. We tried to basically solve this question by, in several steps, teasing apart, like, how many suicides happen, how many homicides happen, how much is accidental, how much is related to the policies out there. My position is, and still remains, that we would be safer with fewer guns. That's a position that I still feel strongly about. But the question that's really hard, and that I really did shift sort of existentially on this position, is how do we do that? And I think one of the things that I really learned from this conversation was, many of us come to this question with, like, let's get rid of assault rifles. Let's stop, selling them at gun shows. Let's do background checks. Let's, do the waiting period. Let's do all these things. Couple things became clear as you talk to someone like BJ, is like, well, a lot of states already have this stuff. It doesn't necessarily reduce the gun violence in those states. And the policies that we're pushing are oftentimes, it's really a hard stretch to imagine how they would actually impact the numbers of homicides and gun homicides. And so we really try to zero in on what would be the highest impact policy that we could both agree on to do this. And after a long period of back and forth, we settled on, I think, a position around, rather than federal sort of run organizations with universal background checks, lean on the existing NICS database, which people already do for background checks, and allow states to basically build a DMV for guns, which means that at point of purchase, you have to show your state sort of licensed gun purchasing license that has already proven that there's been some kind of background check for you, that you're not a felon, you're not a domestic abuser, you haven't been deemed mentally ill by a judge, all these things. And then from then on, as long as you have the license, you can buy guns. And by doing the math, and BJ will have much more sort of data on this, because I was really surfing on his ability to produce all these studies that have been made. This could result in a 5% reduction in homicides across the board, and a larger number of just gun homicides. And we know this because certain states have done this, and certain studies have been done to show how the delta has been reached in small pockets of the country. And that was, we ended up coming down to a 5% reduction. Every single state has to do this, so there are definitely challenges, but and it's not a huge number, but to me, making any progress is the foot in the door to making more progress. We'll learn something by doing this if we can do it. It's local. People can decide to sort of do this on a smaller battlefield of their state, and we can sort of take the conversation down from this ideological, thing in the sky to something more on the ground, and that really appealed to me. And in the meantime, I'll wrap it up quick. Some concessions I think should be made. One of them being we should also try to tackle suicides directly. We should try to tackle domestic abuse directly, and sort of tackle these really acute sources of gun violence in a way that handles them as people and not just through policies. And that could also be done at the state level. And then also things like the ability to give your gun to someone else if you're suicidal. It's currently illegal, and I think that could be illegal. And so like we had a couple concessions that were really small to me, but big to BJ to get, because they are sort of backwards. And then a couple vice versa, where things that seemed big to me were easy for BJ to take on, because just moving from federal to state was pretty easy for me to say. And anyway, that's the summary. I think we can dive into it. It's a gigantic topic, but we came out of it, I think, both feeling pretty jazzed about finding a point of agreement. And we have since gone around and tried to talk to people on both sides of the position to see like whether or not they are, friendly to it or open to it. And we've found a lot of open ears, I think, so far. So that's my summary. Hopefully that made sense.
Cool. So we'll hand it over to BJ now for his 3 to 5 minutes.
I might go over 3 to 5 minutes, but I ask your permission. So I'm not a writer. I'm an engineer. I'm a hydrologist, which is a very statistics heavy field. And my entrance into all this stuff, writing and all the weird paths that have taken me here tonight, had to do with really about Facebook arguments in 2018. And I kept having to cross post the same thing over and over in Facebook arguments. And I was like, why don't I just like clean this up a little bit, add some graphs, stick it on Medium. That stuff went viral. And then I ended up writing about other culture war issues and stuff like that. And as a result of that, I got tied in with a group called Open Source Defense, which is a culture war-free, gun rights, statistics-oriented organization. I went to SHOT Show in January with them. I've written some articles with them. Some of them were tied actually to the letter exchange. I might go into that in a second. From there, I've now gotten several things published in Recoil magazine. I got my first print article in Recoil, this past edition in Recoil 50. And yesterday, this long chain of events led me to doing an hour-long podcast-style interview with Michael Siegel, who is the gun research guy at Boston University who studies that I was heavily referencing in my letter thing with Buster. And it was an amazing experience. And through all of this, what I found is that if you have open dialogue that is looking at statistics and you're willing to set ideology at the door, you come to some resounding conclusions about what we can do and what we can't do, and what kinds of things we can give back to gun owners to convince them that that the gun control people are coming into the argument with good faith. And this is something that Michael stressed heavily in the interview I did with him yesterday, which I believe will be live on Recoil TV next week sometime. And his position as someone who is deeper in the numbers than me or Buster was that generally there are some laws that have been shown to work. Most laws have been shown explicitly not to work. And that we can probably get the laws that do work passed if we give the candy back that they stole. And that part of that is, but the most important thing to get to that point is that is earning the respect and faith from gun owners so that they can get behind board, because they feel like they've been burned. They've been burned a lot. And when an ordinary gun owner opens up a media piece that says something about a gun policy researcher, they're just like, yeah, fuck it, and they throw it away, right? And further, I mean, Michael was very critical of some of the things that politicians in the media have been saying, like, Beto and his, yes, we're coming to take your guns. It's like, well, this isn't helping. And the reason it isn't helping is obviously you get into the numbers, because the stuff they're talking about taking isn't responsible for any of the deaths, right? I think rifles are responsible for like 1% of gun deaths in the country. So the whole argument about rifles is basically a red herring, and has to do with what's scary, and it has to do with playing to people's fears to try and get votes or to try and get clicks, right? And one of the problems that the gun discussion has now is that it has pivoted into this, instead of it being about trying to save lives, it's about trying to attack cultures. And Michael became very aware of this recently through this most recent study that he did. This thing, there it is. This is available now, and it's free. It's from the American Journal of Preventative Medicine, and it was a poll that he did with some research. It'll be a follow-up poll next year to check on it. And it's called "The Meaning of Guns to Gun Owners in the United States: The 2019 National Lawful Use of Guns Survey." So this is part of what his group at Boston University has done, and his group of all of the researchers that are doing this stuff, they are approaching it from the least ideological and the most mathematical position. And I really appreciate all the work that they've done, even more than a lot of the other ones that I've read. If you're going to go and do your own homework, dig up Michael Siegel, see whatever he's written and whatever his group has written that has his name on it. It's going to be good stuff. And the conclusion generally, like part of this is about us, our position in the whole deal is kind of this. The mathematics is this. Gun policy that addresses the features of guns doesn't matter, doesn't work. If somebody's going to murder somebody else, they're going to murder them with whatever kind of gun they have, whether it has a pistol grip on the front or not, whether it's an assault rifle or a pistol. Most of the school shootings that we've had could have been just as easily done with a Glock 9mm that's on the side of every police officer as with a scary looking rifle, these kinds of things, right? The stuff that does work is the stuff that addresses who gets the gun. So universal background checks, for instance, are something that are shown to work. And the reason why is because, about 90% of guns that are sold, they have a background check anyway. You have to get a NICS check when you go to the store to buy a gun. The other remaining 10% are peer-to-peer gun sales from one gun owner to another gun owner. And those don't have a background check. I couldn't get a background check if I wanted. If I wanted to sell a gun to a friend, I don't have the ability to background check him. And when most universal background check laws are proposed, they are proposed with this rider attached that says, and also we're going to have a national firearms registry. And that's the thing that causes all the gun owners to freak out. And one of the things that Siegel did in this study is that he looked at the opinions of gun owners about different kinds of gun laws. And it was the support for a universal background check was very high, but he also disaggregated that and said the support for a national gun registry is very low. So if those things can be pulled apart by the policymakers, they might be able to get one through without having to tag the other one on. It's kind of like a Trojan horse thing that they keep doing, and I think either they don't understand it or they're trying to sneak it in. One of the two. I wouldn't know to speak to them about it. And then the other thing that is, I think, an important piece of the puzzle is that since we know all those other laws don't work, if you package that up, if you're talking about compromised positions, give all that other stuff back. Let the people in California have their AR-15s with their drum magazines, because those laws against those literally don't work, because nobody uses those in crime anyway. You can't knock a liquor store over with a big unwieldy gun. You have to have something to hide in your pants, right? So so there's a lot of stuff that can be given back while you ask for the things that are worth it. Another thing that always pops in Siegel's research is there's not a lot of states that have done this, but there's a few that have. They will add people who have violent misdemeanors to the NICS check. So if you've got a misdemeanor battery on your record, maybe you don't need to buy a gun, right? And most gun owners are cool with that. Like, yeah, okay, keep the gun out of that guy's hand. I don't want him at the shooting range with me, right? So there's things that can be done, but the things that can be done have to focus on the kinds of people who end up with guns and not on what the shape of the gun is that you're allowed to buy, right? And that's and so you can give all this stuff back while asking for this other stuff. It's the kind of position that you would be able to go forward. And the thing that Siegel beat on the most was that in order for the gun owning public to get behind this, the gun owning public has to have trust that the gun policy researchers are entering into their research in good faith. And some of them don't appear to be doing that by my read of some of the studies. Michael is, because of his, like, you know, he was a tobacco researcher for many years, and his approach to tobacco research was not to demonize tobacco users. It was to enter into it as if we're trying to reduce the number of dead smokers, right? You know, that's one of the reasons, for instance, off on the side, he's very pro vaping, and gets frustrated when the CDC comes in as with an anti-vaping stance because of the same kind of thing, right? You know, instead of it being against gun culture, have it be pro safety. And the other thing that I think is important to mention with me and Buster's dialogue, and is that, you know, homicides are only a third of the problem. 1/3, 2/3 are suicides. 2/3 of gun deaths in the country are people intentionally killing themselves with their own guns. It doesn't matter what kind of gun you have to do that. A 1-bullet gun will do that for you. It ain't like you're going to miss. And while men outnumber women 3 to 1 in suicides, they outnumber women 7 to 1 in gun suicides. And female suicides aren't correlated at all with gun ownership rates, but male suicides are. So there's something unique about the male mind and what leads them to suicide. It's probably hastier, and, you know, when you make a hasty decision with a gun, you don't have time to undo the decision, right? And the gun culture is slowly becoming aware of this, but it's one of the most important things to reducing overall gun deaths in the country is for gun culture itself to understand the suicide problem. And, you know, if you could, you could reduce gun suicides by 20-30%, you can save more people than are, you could save 2 or 3 times the number of overall deaths as are in domestic homicide in the whole country on a yearly basis. And the most important thing about that is making sure that that
Hey,
suicide is
BJ,
not stigmatized. Yeah.
Let's get to exchange. Is there anything else
Go
you'd like
for
to
it.
say if you're open? Okay.
No,
So
that's fine. That's
good.
the suicide thing is the biggest thing that we need to do. We need
Cool.
to focus on.
So now there's going to be a 20-minute portion between Buster and BJ. I'll hand over to Buster, and then I'll jump in, and then we'll go for some Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting. I mean, that's so, I can't wait to hear what your conversation was with him. I think that the thing that seems so like obvious to coming out of the conversation that wasn't obvious, it just seems too small to really have a big impact, is that why don't we self-reflect on our policies, actually try to disentangle just the position of every single policy must be pushed because we just have to get momentum in that direction and it will create a snowball, because that's not how it works. What we have to do is we have to be smart about the policies. We have to roll back for the ones that have been proven not to work, the ones that are the sticking points that people still feel resentful for because they're bad policies that, you know, punish people for the wrong reasons, and just because they can't relate to them. And that's it seems small, but I think it's the key here, right? To get people to actually trust that there is some kind of not only one way push from both sides, it's a two-way give and take. And I don't know how that happens with large groups. It can happen with one-on-one conversations, and I think that's why we got there. But even in a one-on-one conversation where I'm trying to represent my demographic and my sort of like my position group, you do revert back to that. Like, I'm just going to push for everything and try to whack you as much as I can on your weak points. But it's just so unhealthy. It's so unproductive, and we don't make any progress in the conversation that way. So two people that are trying to have these kind of conversations, I think, you know, one of the things that has worked for us in this conversation and in other ones is just to right up front try to listen to the criticisms that seem obviously accurate and unimportant, right? Because those are oftentimes things like that, you know, that we think so little of them because they're not important to us, but it's really important to somebody else. And if we can give those back, that's the first sort of a gift into the conversation, to the dialogue, that then creates the goodwill, because you have to generate this goodwill somehow. And this is one way to do it, other than like establishing a really long relationship with that other person and trusting them as a human. Gifts are one way to, and so like why we do this in diplomacy, why we do it in other sort of traditions. And you know, I think in fact in our conversation, BJ was the first one to make concessions to me, which, you know, it was shocking how effective it was for like just sort of softening my tone a little bit, because like he was talking about things that were a little bit over my head in terms of policies and organizations and data. And then in a follow-up letter, he said like, oh, actually, I double checked that thing I said 2 letters ago, and that was wrong. I forget exactly what it was about, but I think it was about the UK sort of violence rates in the beginning, and where they weren't actually measuring apples and apples. And I didn't dig deep enough to actually confirm that, but he volunteered that as information right up front. And that was so eye-opening for me. I think it really opened the conversation up, because when you can volunteer to like expose your own mistakes, suddenly you realize you're on the same side, and that's a position where these conversations can happen. So most of the shifts that I made, I think, sort of like policy-wise, were things that I don't even care that much about, and I don't like and we both care about the same thing, which is reducing, you know, death and violence and homicide. So that was just like a really standout thing for me, and I feel lucky to have like been in conversation with BJ, because I've had, you know, in my background, I did a bunch of salons in my house and tried to do them online around gun control, and it's so hard to even get people into the same room, because everyone thinks it's a trap. Everyone thinks that like, oh, you're gonna, you know, pretend to be friendly, and you're gonna bring all these people in that you disagree with, and then you're gonna attack them. And that's just a sign of like how much bad will is fostered in this. Like, we're not only strong and sort of entrenched in our positions, but we have given up on even talking to other people, because we think they're going to come in and not even talk to us as humans. So that's one thing that sort of at a meta level, like it was really nice to find BJ and you know, find other people on Letter that have this ability to sort of be in disagreement and also admit mistakes, admit sort of the weak points, and invite people to come in and tweak them and try to figure out what's going on there. So
Michael was worried about that with the Recoil interview yesterday. He, you know, the first thing he asked me was like, you know, is Recoil going to chop this up and edit it? He was worried that it would be an hour discussion and then they would cut 5 minutes out that was the most undermining or whatever, take stuff out of context or whatnot, because that's what media does nowadays. That's like they give you an hour and they do whatever.
That's why podcasts are so great.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I you know, might be putting my foot in my mouth there. I really hope that Recoil doesn't do that with what I'm going to give them, because I'm about to pass them an hour and 20 minutes. But they've been very positive, very open about it. And so I think that I doubt that they'll do anything like that. But, you know, I think that they're probably possibly unique in the gun media space, that it being a outlet that wouldn't do that, right? Because that's how the wars are fought. The wars are fought by taking people out of context and sticking them in media, and then trolling, and then splashing that into an echo chamber and trying to get the echo chamber to share it around, right? And this is the thing that kind of pivoted me away from writing about guns and into writing about media criticism and culture war stuff on my personal blog, because I started to see once I'd gotten 5 or 6 articles into writing the stuff, and I started to see which ones got traffic and which one didn't. The stuff that got the traffic was the culture war stuff. Was anything that's useful in a culture war argument. The arms dealing in the culture war is what makes you money in our modern media landscape, because that's what people share on Facebook. And so that connection is tremendously unhealthy. And it's not just in the gun space, it's in all of the spaces. And it's everywhere. It's about everything, whether you keep a school open or closed for COVID, or whether you, you know, or any of it, all of it. It's always that. It's like, how can I turn this into a culture war weapon to get clicks out of it, is the first thing that, you know, journalist nowadays does. And that's horribly. It's
It's
horribly
interesting to
toxic.
see how even like the pandemic, like at the beginning, we were all thinking that like this, we all have this in common. We don't want to get sick and die. We don't want each other to get sick and die. And then it collapsed into these polarized sort of political positions around masks and about, sort of, your personal freedoms. And I was surprised. At first I was surprised that that didn't happen immediately because I was just
Well, I
sort
think
of,
it happened when people started talking about coming off the lockdown. I think that was when the first thing everybody bought into the flattening the curve, and then once the curve was flat and ICUs weren't overloaded, then suddenly that was right when it got polarized. Was it's like, okay, now it's time to get on with business, and then people were like, no, we have to extinguish the disease, and there were people like, it's not extinguishable in that way, and then at that point,
mm,
everything got turned into a us versus them thing,
yeah.
and
And it didn't
that's
help that the experts like just turned out to be highly confident and then ultimately wrong around masks. That was
well,
definitely
not just
weaponized against us.
well, not just the masks, but the Imperial College projections on where things were going to go turned out to be wrong. There was a lot of because I mean, you're kind of rolling dice with this thing anyway. Nobody really knows anything about it. You can't predict something you've never seen before,
Right, right.
and so yeah, that was. And I don't want to turn this whole thing into COVID. We should still talk about guns instead of COVID. But that was just one example of that happens on every space, and it has been happening for a very long time, and in my mind, it all goes back to that. When I talked to Michael yesterday, I asked him this specifically. I'm like, do you think that you can get that, you can use this research that you've done? Because his conclusion was basically that, gun policy researchers need to do better about reaching out to gun people and understanding gun stuff and yielding the fact that it's okay to buy a gun. And then let's talk about what we can do instead of what we can't, because you can't reduce the number of guns in the United States. It's not feasible. You could, there's some argument that if we're able to get the United States down to the boundary area where like England is, that you might create enough scarcity to where criminals could buy guns, find a gun. But we've got so many guns here right now. You could magically evaporate half the guns in the country, and a criminal could still find 5 if they needed them. We've got so many that's just not an attainable goal. And that would
Yeah,
be true whether I was pro-gun or anti-gun. You got a lot of guns
yeah,
around here, and
yeah,
so, but what he was saying was that um, policy researchers need to be, he thought that policy researchers could be more honest, could be more open, could enter into things with a little bit more faith, and could try and prove to the gun people that there is good faith there. And I was like, do you think that would extend to the politicians? He says, yeah, I think so. And I didn't want to disagree with him in the interview, but I disagree with him. I don't think that jump is. I don't think that it can make that jump. And the reason
yeah.
why I don't think it can make that jump is because of the media engine and the politics engine that feed back on each other. If you find a
Yeah.
conclusion they don't want to hear on either side, then they're not going to listen.
I mean, I find that hopeful. I mean, I think the reason I'm so interested in productive disagreement as a skill that you develop and you practice is because it has to be bottoms up. It has to be something that you practice individually. And as soon as we sort of amass enough people that have the skill, then the politicians have to get in line because they're there to represent the people. When we only project our worst sort of cynical, nightmarish hellscape, world onto our politicians and ask them to be our generals, then that's what they become. And somehow we have to work with ourselves and figure out like how do we create more productive conversations in the streets, in our rooms, in our in our families, in our friend groups, in our online interactions.
Do you
To
think
the
that's possible on a
Yes,
large
I do.
scale?
Yeah, I think. I mean, it's one of my like most hopeful probably beliefs. I may be optimistic, but I think I've seen it happen to individuals. Um, and the fact that this exists, that the STOA exists, and like medic mediation, all this stuff that's coming to, I know you still think it's like a tiny little bubble in a gigantic vast sea, but the fact that that bubble wasn't there 2 years ago and now it is, I think is hopeful because these things do have to first appear as a bubble, and then they can become a bigger thing. But
Yeah, maybe.
how long that takes.
I mean, my perception of the STOA and of productive disagreements and letter.wiki, that kind of thing is I feel like there's this giant war that's happening in a big battlefield, and then when people get injured enough from the battlefield, they wander off into the woods and then they meet each other and then they sit down and they talk about why they're warring and they think it was kind of stupid and they figure they'd rather talk it out instead of participating in the war. But I don't think there's very many people back here in the woods with us. And
I wouldn't call us the wounded and I think there is still hope and optimism, right, that you wouldn't have if you were just dying in a ditch in the woods, right? Like I think some of the people in doing this kind of thing are some of the most, the kindest, strongest, like honestest, most authentic people in the public sphere right now. But
I agree with that. But the fact is, I mean, I don't know. I want to say the fact, but that's inferring a fact that maybe it's not true. I don't know. But my perception is that the fact that what we have here, let's say, for instance, that we're the kindest, most thoughtful, most so and such people, and we're off here in the woods talking. Are you sure you can get all those people in the field over here? I don't think you can. I am pessimistic that you can get that many of them off the battlefield. And I'm curious what strategy you'd like to do to get people off that battlefield. I think letter.wiki is an interesting approach. And I think that what they nailed first off was that a lot of the reasons why people are warring is because of user interface, right? It's UI based. Like when you get into a letter.wiki conversation, you're kind of forced to be explanatory and forced to be kind. And you're funneled into a better version of speaking than on Twitter, where everything is just about who can farm the most clicks from hot takes. Yeah. But even that aside, how many people in the public discourse right now could even have the skills to step up and engage in a letter.wiki exchange? I don't know that there's that many people that do anymore. I'm worried about that.
Right. Well, that's a skill we have to develop. I think that even more important than the UI is the design, the incentive structures of the platforms themselves, and just hearing Clyde and Dane talk about how they want to build, how they sort of create the incentives for themselves to most likely encourage them to build a platform that most likely develops these skills in people. I think that's where I was at Twitter for 5 years, and I saw how, like, when the incentives are to get people to click on ads, it just informs every single one of your decisions, and it puts the power into the wrong place. The fact that they're trying to now think about a pro account kind of thing, and are I think they admit that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube have severely damaged our culture in many ways that maybe they didn't intend to, but they did. And it's time, I think they are starting to commit themselves to changing the incentives for themselves. And they're companies that can move fast if they want to. I don't know if they want to, but they could if they had reached that point in their shift.
This might be a good point to pivot to some questions in the chat box. Let's go with, oh man. Okay, Megan had a really good question. Yeah, Megan had a really good question. Let's go with Megan first.
Thanks both. To me, there's a sticky point in the background check idea, which is about mental illness. On the one hand, obviously that really does need to be part of a background check, but on the other hand, I think that it has huge potential for weaponization. The definition of it is really subjective. There's some shady stuff going on with pharmaceuticals that's affecting the definition of what's a mental illness. And then there's, the opinions of, our neighbors, as someone else pointed out, what your neighbor can report you, and it becomes extremely subjective and potentially weaponizable. I can't really see a solution to that problem there. Is that something that either of you have some thoughts you could share with us?
Go ahead, BJ. Okay, I'll go be quick. I think you know more about this than I do, but sure. I think that's why we put that aside to a large extent. Like, all the studies that have been made are about existing structures that exist. Like, so the NICS database does have a mental illness thing, but I think it's just like, if you're judged mentally unfit in a court of law or by a judge, which is a lot further, away than, you're on, Prozac or something. So by just saying that, like, the data we found showed that even at that, like, really extreme level, that it could still impact the homicide rate, the violence rate. Once we have more nuance, and I think that's a follow-up question, is like, if this works to reduce violence and we can continue to start to collaborate with each other on policy, then addressing mental illness, like a much bigger problem, I think, than even guns. So
me and Michael,
sidestepped it.
me and Michael talked about red flag laws in the thing yesterday, and red flag laws were surprisingly popular in his poll, which I thought was very surprising, because all the gun owners I know are freaked out about red flag laws. And the devil with those things is in the details, right? So if what Michael was advocating in the discussion was, it's like, okay, if you decide, because red flag laws are mostly meant to protect suicidal people. And if you're a family member, you discover that, your dad or something like that is having suicidal thoughts or tendencies or something like that, you might want to, get your family member red flag to get the guns out of the house or something like that. And Michael's approach was that his understanding of those things was that it was voluntary, that they would come and say, would you like us to hold on to your guns for you voluntarily? And then they say yes. So that might not be so bad, right? If it gets up to the point where your neighbor can red flag you because they know you have guns and they're pissed off that you didn't mow your lawn for 2 weeks, that can be a very different thing. And so the devil in the details of that is really extreme. The other problem with just talking about in the United States, it would be untenable to flag somebody for a NICS check for being on a psychoactive drug, because a huge number of people in the United States are on this damn drugs. It's like 20 or 30% or something like that. It's outright. Now, don't quote me on that. Look it up, and whatever number you look up is going to be, you're going to be like, are you kidding me? It's outrageous how many people are on a routine pharmaceutical that has psychotropic effects, and you'll often see, oh, well, the mass shooter, he was taking this drug or that drug or whatnot. And it's almost like, well, gracious, so is everybody else. And so, and then, the other thing that ties in with that too, is that if you were to come up with a law that said that anybody who had suicidal tendencies got their guns taken away unilaterally by the government, then less people who are gun owners who were having a rough patch would seek treatment. And you've created a disincentive for them to seek treatment in the first place, which makes things worse instead of better. And that's got to get taken into the discussion too. So it's it is as sticky as it gets. You're absolutely correct. It is so sticky. But all of those things have to be factored in. And in some cases, state laws, like, Buster mentioned, you're not allowed to exchange guns. It's, I can hand my guns to a friend for safekeeping in Georgia today, no problem. If I were living in California, I would have to take them to a gun store. I'd have to take my friend to a gun store. They would have to run the background check on the friend. They'd have to hold the guns there for whatever the waiting period is before they can give them to the friend. And then if I ended up committed for some reason between now and the time when I wanted my guns back, I might be prohibited from getting them back. And so all of those things would tend to make it so that I, as a California gun owner, would just not do any of that. Right. So they take that problem and they make it worse. Now, does that worseness show up in the statistics? I can't say yes. I don't know for sure. I don't know that anybody studied that deeply. I tried to look at it a little bit and I didn't see much difference. So I don't know the answer to that. Like, I'm going to put that out. But intuitively, it would seem to me that some of these things were supposedly passed for people's safety are making them more unsafe, because they weren't totally thought out about the unintended consequences of them. So it's a very complicated thing that needs to be teased out, and people, we need to be honest about it,
Yeah. Whenever I have this conversation, I think I always, 9 out of 10 times I come away thinking that I know a lot less about anything than I know more. Like we tend to, in our own time, come up with pretty simple, clear, and confident positions about things. And then if you actually look at how hard it is, I think it's okay to feel this feeling of like, oh man, there isn't an easy solution here. Let's not even try to solve that one yet. Let's try to, let's work on the easier ones, and that's okay, I think, because this problem's not going to go away. And if we tackle the hardest one first and we get it wrong because we're not good at this yet, then that's going to disincentivize us from continuing. We're going to like, oh, we tried that. You came up with something stupid that didn't work. We're not going to try that again. So I really like trying to focus on the lower hanging fruit as we develop the skill.
Before we go to another question, I think there's something else to insert here, and that is that not everything requires a government fix. Some things can be fixed culturally. And that, particularly with the suicide thing, that's something that we can make a lot of progress inside the gun community, just culturally, with awareness and things like that. I'm working with one group that's working on that. I might end up interviewing them for Recoil. And there's at least one other group. I think his name is Dan Voss and Voss and Pinker got together. This is the former head of the Brady campaign, abandoned the Brady campaign because he was so sick of the people at the Brady campaign attacking gun culture instead of trying to save gun owners' lives, and joined up with a prior gun rights advocate who is kind of a lightning rod himself to come up with, cultural solutions to the suicide problem. And so that's relatively new. And so some of the enculturation effects of trying to fix that problem just among us on our end are in the early stages and might bear fruit sometime soon. We'll see.
Cool. Nathan, you had a question on the black market. Nathan Pierce, if you can unmute yourself.
Oh, he says mic doesn't work.
Mic doesn't work, okay. While I find his question, Dane, you had some interesting questions for both BJ and Buster. Could you unmute yourself and ask them?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Well, I had a question for Buster first. I was wondering whether you own a gun personally, and if not, does the political turmoil and all the riots and uncertainty in the United States make you more inclined to want that sort of self-protection?
Yeah, I don't own a gun. My grandfather owns a bunch of guns. A couple of my aunts and uncles do. I've fired guns. I've gone to shooting ranges. I've shot, cans in the hills, and had a BB gun when I was a kid. But I don't have one. I don't plan to get one. I think you could probably say that, one of the things that really changed my position on this actually early on was to say like, well, what can I do to make, guns less proliferating everywhere? I was like, what if there was a contract that I could sign to like waive my right to guns permanently? And would I do that? And the answer was no. And it made me think like, okay, well, I want the right to have a gun. I just don't want to have a gun. And then it sort of fit into this many other sort of positions I have. It was like, yeah, I don't want to do that, but I don't want to remove the right to have it. And especially when I started thinking about domestic violence and women in abusive relationships, like I think that's one of the only demographics of people that if they do have a gun, they're less likely to die. And like, so I would never want to unevenly roll this out and say like, women can't have guns. That would be terrible. Like minorities and sort of disenfranchised people can't have guns. Like that would be terrible. Like you really have to start with the people that have the most power and work your way down, which means that, but that said, like I don't have one. I don't plan to have one. I probably became a little bit more likely to get one when, as like these federal agents are coming to Oakland or, Portland, like, but I still think I'd be more likely to kill myself or my family than anyone else or by having one.
And then the question I had for both of you was, because I read the conversation again recently for the competition, and it was so awesome. And I felt like real progress was made, but it's not clear to me how that translates into, the real world, and I wondered what your take is, both of you, on what the future of gun law actually looks like in the United States, if you were to kind of put on your predictor hat.
Do you want to give it a try?
Gracious. Well, okay. So first off, I can probably take a couple of sprinkles from Buster's last question and put it in and talk about gun ownership changes in the past 6 months due to uncertainties. We had a huge gun buying spike in April. We had another one in May. We had another one in June, and the spikes were not. We've had gun buying spikes before in the United States, and it's usually something like, "Oh my God, Hillary's about to win. I have to buy a rifle that she's going to ban." Right? That's usually the form that they take, and these are familiar to gun store owners. And what was really curious about the COVID gun buying spike was, and I'm talking about, it was insane. Gun stores were just cleaned out. You had little old ladies buying 357 Magnums because it was the only thing left. They were just like, sell me any gun you have, right? That's what happened in the United States in the rush to COVID. Once everybody started getting freaked out, it was, and the gun store owners are talking about, these are the toilet paper buyers. They have to protect their toilet paper, right?
It's all connected.
It's all connected. And the curious thing about this was that these were almost overwhelmingly new gun owners. And if you look at the number of guns that have been sold, and this new gun owner trend has carried, because you had the rush about COVID, then you had the rush about the protests, then you've got, once the riots started to turn violent, then you had another spike. And it's not just it's not just conservatives. There's a lot of liberals that are buying them too. I've had several friends. I have one friend who's a hippie, lives on a mountaintop in, Asheville, North Carolina. Guy's been to 100 dead shows. Call me on the phone, ask me what kind of gun to buy. Okay. If you look at the overall numbers and you follow NSSF estimates of how many are new, if you were to take a random sample of 20 gun owners in the United States, 1 out of 20 bought their gun this year. What you see in policy is that generally places with a higher gun ownership rate have less gun laws, and sometimes you'll see research studies that are like, look, there's less gun deaths in states that have higher gun laws, but that's probably just related to the fact there's fewer gun owners, so there's less people with access to a gun or whatever. And the reason, and it's a reverse thing. It's the states with more gun owners are more inclined to vote against gun laws, right? So the fact that the number of gun owners is growing, and it's going to be a tremendous spike, the likes of which we have never seen probably in at least the last 50 or 60 years on a differential basis this year, is going to impact how many gun laws get passed. And so there's that. The next thing is that, where gun laws go nationally is going to depend who wins. All right. And we don't know who's going to win. The Biden has adopted a general gun control position that is very similar to what the state legislature in Virginia adopted. And a lot of those guys won. And so Virginia is generally a red state, flipped blue this past time around back during the midterms. Democratic governor, and now they have a Democratic majority in their state legislature. But that Democratic majority lives almost entirely outside of Washington, D.C., and in the Richmond suburbs and around Norfolk. The whole rest of the state geographically is red. Okay. But there's enough population in those centers to where they control it. They walked in and they dropped an entire, their first, legislative period, they dropped a stack of gun laws that were this thick. They're going to pass these 10 different gun laws, right? And, they ran on it. Then they got elected. And what happened there was that every county outside of those counties that had those Democrat things, they all declared themselves sanctuary counties. They said, we're not going to enforce these laws if you pass them. It was a huge deal. And there was a lot of friction about it. This whole thing was going around in January. And right before they started voting on them, there was a big protest in Richmond where over 30,000, I think the official number was 24, but I've talked to some people who were down there, and they said it was over 30,000 people marching peacefully with open carrying AR-15 rifles, walking up and down the street, right? And nobody got shot. They cleaned up after themselves. They left. They didn't break anything. But You know, and then when all the counties went sanctuary, you know, a lot of the legislators, they passed some of their laws, but they didn't pass that assault weapons ban because they were scared to. They were like, it's not going to work. How are we going to enforce it? You know, the number of people who showed up at that rally was on the order of 5 times the total. I think it was 5. I have to go back and look. The total amount of active duty National Guard in Virginia. So how are they going to enforce that stuff? They can't, right? So if Biden gets elected and tries to push that stuff, then you're going to see some flavor of that happen at the national scale. If Trump wins, then it's like, well, so first off, before the election, it's likely that Trump's going to rattle off a bunch of executive orders that clean up some gun laws and stuff like that are buying votes from gun owners. Afterwards, I don't think he's going to do anything else than what's already done. And I also don't think, by my read on the current Supreme Court, I don't think that they're going to grant any of the major gun cases that are brought up for the Supreme Court. I don't think they're going to rule them, even though technically there's kind of a Republican majority, if you want to call them that, on the current Supreme Court, because I don't think they necessarily have the votes to try and push any major Second Amendment stuff. So I think if Trump wins, we're going to be about the state we are now. And I think if Biden wins, we're going to see some kind of national replay of what happened in Virginia. And that's my read on it. I don't know whether it's true or not, but you asked me to speculate, so there it is.
Cool. So we're approaching the hour, so we're going to end shortly. Do you guys have any closing thoughts before I close out today's session?
I really like the questions in here that we didn't get to as well. So I'm bummed we didn't get those, but I'm always open to a conversation on letter if anyone wants to talk about it, about this stuff. And yeah, I see this as like one doorway into a complex problem, which is what I always just think of as just the inability to have conversations with people. Because if we can't talk to people that we disagree with, everything is going to break. All the conversations are going to fall over. Guns is a hard one, but so is immigration. So is, every other, education and healthcare and all these things have the same exact problem. And if we expect the politicians to solve it for us, we're going to be waiting a long time. We have to solve it for ourselves first, so that we can then imagine that it's possible to have a good conversation, and then start to expect our leaders and elected officials to actually have the skill too. And I think that's the only way forward. Like, I don't think politicians are going to solve this, regardless of who's elected. I think they can make it worse in very different ways, or do no harm, which is also great. Don't make it worse. But yeah, yeah. That said, I definitely have a preference for politicians and candidates that get elected for other reasons.
I'll piggyback off that. I think there's two kind there. Well, you can do binary models of everybody. There's two kinds of people, right? Or whatever. But I think that some of the frustrations that people have now about politics are that there's no good leaders. And I think there's two kinds of people. There's some people who are like, they make their own decisions. They decide things for themselves. And then they don't really need a leader to tell them what to do. But there's some people that do need a leader to tell them what to do. And they, I think, are the ones that are in the most turmoil right now with the leadership that we have, right? And I think that in order to foster these productive conversations and whatnot, I think one of the things we have to do is we have to look to how do we make it so that people are not so dependent on leadership to do their thinking for them. And I don't know the answer to that question. And I wish I did. Because I haven't been thinking about it long. And maybe that's hopeless, and maybe I need to reframe the question and come up with a different approach. But that's the thing I've been chewing on for the last couple of days. And I don't know the answer. My problem is when I get into these difficult I get into difficult conversations and I start looking at, well, how would we solve it? And, I mean, Buster's an optimist and I admire that in Buster, and I'm just a pessimist. And maybe we should do a whole letter thing on optimism and pessimism. I don't know, but I don't, I spend a lot of time looking for hope, and sometimes I just can't find it, because every time somebody's like, "Oh, we can just do this," and I'm like, "Yeah, but that's not going to work." So, but this is positive, and if this grows, maybe you need a slogan where if people are pissing on each other on Twitter, that it can just be like, "Take it to me, take it to letter," right, or some kind of thing like that, where it was like something that you sort of like, "I'll meet you on letter." It's kind of like, all right, let's go outside,
Like the new flagpole.
Oh, yeah, something. And then maybe you can get people to start having these difficult conversations and more productive discourses by simply saying, "I'm willing to have a productive discourse. Are you?" And then see what they say. Maybe that could work. I don't know. It's I get with the Rathbones and brainstorm up marketing ideas for letter or something. I don't know.
Save us, Rathbones.
On that note, so this was the first test of the Postscript series. I think I might make it 90 minutes next time. I might iterate with some of the kind of the conversational techniques, and then make it more interactive, maybe go in breakout rooms, and also figure out how to kind of integrate it with the letter platform. So I'd love to talk to you, BJ, Buster, afterwards to figure out maybe how to do that for part 2. I'm trying to get John Vervaeke and Dave Chapman in for the second one, because they had an excellent exchange. I know John is keen on that. So that being said, I know Clyde privately messaged me. He's putting his son to bed right now. But Dane, do you want to say anything about letter, how people can go on and check it out if they haven't been there before?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment on the take it to letter, because that is literally the sort of catchphrase that we've been trying to promote as a little meme. So there's definitely some synergy there. We haven't quite figured out how to get that to go viral yet, but there's been some exciting developments. Yeah. We'll add cat gifts to it. But yeah, I mean, the competition, impossible competition, competitions closed, but the battle of ideas is raging on. So if anyone wants to get involved, there's a few ways you can do it. You can just go to letter.wiki. It's free to use. Anyone can sign up, and you can start a conversation. You can either write an open letter encouraging other people to respond. But if you have an interlocutor in mind, it's easiest if you just reach out to them and say, "Hey, would you like to have this conversation with me?" And hopefully they agree, and then you both sign up, and it's hopefully the user interface is simple enough that you can just get the conversation started. But you can email me, Dane at karma.wiki, if you have any trouble. And yeah, we'd love to have you. And the more difficult, and more important the conversation, the better. So.
Great. Yeah, I definitely recommend checking out. It's very fun, engaging in the letter exchange as well. I've done multiple myself. So next week or the week after, that's the second edition of the Postscript is coming on. If you have any feedback, message myself. You can email me. I'm thinking about 90 minutes, breakout rooms and stuff like that. And upcoming events of the STOA, you can check out the website. We have a bunch as always. And if you'd like to support the STOA, you can go to our Patreon page and support us there. All right, everyone. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for putting this together, Peter.
Pleasure.
See you around.